We are looking at a lot of people signing in here. We're very excited to have you all with us. Hopefully you all can hear me okay. We are essentially here with our panelists, and we have a very robust conversation happening. We've got some polling questions that we will fill in. But to get things started with your chat box, if everybody would please let us know right in where you are calling from, your country, your region, state, whatever you prefer, and let us know which sport is your favorite or which sport are you missing most right now. Wonderful. We've got Scottsdale, Arizona. All right, London. Perfect. All right. So with that, as people are writing in and letting us know where they're at, I'm going to turn it over to you, Ken, to get started.
All right, we decided the correct welcome to everyone is a good day. So good day, everybody, and thanks for joining us. So this is the first from the Global Sport Institute, the first in our series of around the world conversations. And we all know when this really hit its peak, that was essentially when the World Health Organization on March 11th declared this a global pandemic, which also happened to be the same day that an NBA player tested positive for the virus. And from there, the world has not been the same. And we decided to have this conversation to take ourselves more deeply into this and to engage people around the world in a way that we haven't traditionally done from the Global Sport Institute. We were scheduled to have our first major event of the spring, our Global Sports Summit, today. Obviously, we had to cancel that, and then we came up with this idea. And I really want to thank the panelists who very readily, when I reached out to them across the board, all of them said, yes, I'd be happy to join the conversation. And we've had really a great time leading up to this. So I can't wait for you all to hear the insights that these people from around the globe have. So what I'd like to do is by tweeting or involved in social media, please use the hashtag Global Sport Matters. Hashtag Global Sport Matters. That's no S on sport. So we're doing the full global thing and keeping it international. So, but let me introduce our panelist, our conversationalist, and I'm really, as I told them today, just the kind of the ringleader, keeping the conversation on track. First from South Africa, and also speaking about Africa, Ilhaam Groenewald. She's the chief director of Matisse Sports at Stellenbosch University. She's an executive board member also of South African Rugby Union. Representing Eurasia, Simon Chadwick. So he's really going to give us insights on, he definitely will lean towards talking about Great Britain, but he will focus primarily on Asia and the Middle East. He's the director of Eurasian sport at Ilhaam. I joked earlier about this, my only French for the day, business school. From Australia, we have from ABC News Radio and from the great podcast, The Ticket, Tracey Holmes. Talking about Latin America, we have Andres Martinez. He's the Arizona State University professor of practice and journalist and a researcher on globalization of soccer. Europe, James Skinner, he is the director of sport business at Loughborough University in London. And especially since I've been in Arizona, recognizing the need to focus on original people whenever we have these conversations. We have Natalie Welch, who's an assistant professor of sport management and sports marketing at Linfield College, and she's an enrolled member of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Nations. So she will talk about the Native American communities, especially and around the globe as well. So with that, why don't we get underway? We've got a lot of people on board already. I'm looking at a lot of questions from people online. But let's just open it up. And Simon, you've got kind of the most territories under your belt. Why don't we start off with you? Tell us what's been happening, and everybody. I want to kind of go around quickly, maybe a quick hit on what's been happening in your part of the world in the past couple of weeks, and coupled with that, how have people, not elite athletes, been continuing to participate in sport? But Simon, if you'd start off and kind of tell us what's going on Middle East and Asia.
So I think for the last four months, I've lived a kind of strange existence in the sense that I was in China just before Christmas. And then I, after Christmas, was working in Manchester in my previous job. I spent some time in the Middle East in January. And then at the beginning of March, I went to work in France. And now I'm back in Britain. And so what's been really interesting is I've been watching for the last 10 weeks something heading our way. And so what came as a big surprise and a big shock for many people, certainly in Western Europe, it was entirely predictable. It was coming. You could see it, as I say, 6, 7, 8 weeks out. So my territory, my turf, if you like, is anywhere between, I guess, anywhere between Britain and Tokyo. We've got big example of the Tokyo Olympics postponed, but I have a particular interest in China. Part of my role involves working in China. We've seen Chinese sport effectively shut down at all levels. Last week was a really significant one in China because for the first time since the lockdown began, the Chinese government gave people the permission to do very simple things like go to a park and kick a ball. There was an initial hope.
So unlike the United States, people were fully locked down in China. I mean, going out to participate in sport was
so and I don't want to digress too much and steal the thunder of anybody else, but obviously the political decision-making process and the structure of government and the culture of engaging with governments is very different in China to, say, the United States and Britain. So, in other words, government said, don't kick a ball in a park. Okay, that's it. We're not going to kick a ball in a park. There had been some suggestions that at some stage over the next month, perhaps Chinese professional sport would begin again. But this last 7 days, effectively, China is shut down again. The borders are shut. You can't enter, you can't leave. And it's looking like Chinese Super League season in soccer, the Chinese basketball season just won't begin on time.
Okay, and we'll come back to that because the idea of when will sport restart is going to be important. China is kind of leading the way on the calendar, and we'll get a chance to see what happens there, and the idea of playing all the games in one central location. All those things are things that we'll get to. Tracey, why don't we go to you? You've been kind enough to get up the earliest. So what's been going on in Australia the past couple of weeks, and what kind of fitness opportunities are the regular people having based on what's going on in the country?
Well, there's not much really, because we've essentially entered a shutdown mode as well. And that basically means unless you're going out to work, unless you're going out to buy goods that you need or to help somebody who may have a medical situation, the advice is that you stay at home. And it's a little bit more than advice because people have already been pulled over by police. And if they don't have what the police consider at that time to be a valid reason to be out of your home, you're issued with on-the-spot $1,000 fines. The potential is for those fines to be bigger, and there's also a potential for 6 months in prison. So they're pretty serious about this here. I live in Sydney, which is in the state of New South Wales. So each of the states are slightly different. The Prime Minister of the country is trying to coordinate it from a national perspective, but all of those sorts of policing issues, education issues, work issues, whether companies are shut down or not, they kind of fit under a state jurisdiction. So you've got this interesting move where the Prime Minister puts out some sort of advice, and then the states interpret that according to their own situation. And it's toughest in the state of New South Wales and Victoria, which is where most of the people live. It's also where most of the businesses are centred, and not surprisingly, where most of the COVID-19 cases exist. But essentially, there's no sport. Sport has been shut down. We have a number of sports now that are facing issues of insolvency because they can't be played, because they're not going to be broadcast on TV, and TV is where they get all their money. They're facing quite dire situations. And we're talking about some of our most professional leagues. So we're talking about soccer, rugby league, Aussie rules, if anyone's heard of that sport. Yeah, it's quite a situation.
So what about in terms of going out for a jog or playing golf and that sort of thing? What's happening in the country?
They say you can do that, but again, it very much depends on which policeman or policewoman you happen to bump into that day. So they say that you can go outside of your house for fitness, but they advise you not to. So they leave it up to personal interpretation. They've actually shut parks, especially for children. They've roped off any kind of play equipment so that nobody can go there. Originally, they said that you could go and exercise in a park with a group of people if you kept your distance and there was a personal trainer with you. But they're discouraging that as well, because first there was a limit of only 10 people being able to gather together. They've reduced that to 2. The exception is if you're with family members. But again, if you've got 5 people in your family and you go for a walk around the block, you need to be separate from each other.
Yeah. Andres, what about Latin America?
Well, hello everybody, and Ken, I'm sorry we couldn't be meeting today in person for the Global Summit, but it's great that you've done this. One of the things that I think, like a lot of us gathered today, I like to think a lot about the intersection of sport and globalization, and you and I have talked a lot about how it feels like sport hasn't revisited globalization in the same way that politics has, and it still sort of hasn't gotten the memo that we were rethinking globalization. And it's been interesting to see how that has played out in the context of the pandemic, because I think when you look at Latin America, the awareness that COVID-19 was coming and that it was going to be a huge societal, if not existential threat, came later, is coming later than it has in other parts of the world. But because sport, in particular football, soccer, is more globalized, there's been this interesting dynamic where the professional sports leagues, I think, were more attuned and alert to this coming threat than political institutions were. Mexico and Brazil, which roughly half the population of all of Latin America, had been notorious for having political leaders in Jair Bolsonaro and López Obrador in Mexico who have been very slow to recognize the need to take measures. Bolsonaro accused Brazilian soccer of being hysterical for shutting down when it did, because the president of the country had not felt that it was yet necessary to take any actions. Similarly in Mexico. And so this interesting dynamic has played out where I think players and clubs and professional leagues were more connected to the outside world than their current political leadership is. They were able to take actions earlier and taking measures. And one of the sort of unintended consequences of that fascinates me is that I feel like professional athletes, professional leagues, and professional teams in a lot of these domestic leagues have become the most important public health communicators and educators in countries like Mexico and Brazil, where the public authorities have been slow to react. Talking the other day to a good friend of mine who runs marketing and communications for Monterrey, the Rayados, a Mexican professional team. They're the defending champions. He would want me to throw that in. But he said, look, we're all spending 95% of our time trying to figure out how to communicate to our community that they need to stay at home. It's just that is basically become their full-time job on the part of his team, staff, and players. So it's a very interesting way in which the importance of sport in society, the representation, the sort of leadership that the celebrityhood of the professional athlete has really connects to the fan base in a way that is, I think, unprecedented in some of these societies.
Thank you, Andres. Natalie, Native communities, especially in the United States, I mean, here, this really gets us to a part of the conversation we need to talk about, and what I'm sort of asking people to get to in a bit. I mean, I think the professional level has gotten a lot of attention, and the impact of leagues shutting down and that sort of thing. But what's happening in the communities that you know so well? And I see that T-shirt too.
I had to do it for you guys. No, it's been really, really tough. It's been, at my heart, I have to say, my heart goes out to the Navajo Nation, who, close to you guys there, ASU has been just ravaged by this, because there are still these communities within our own United States that the majority of the peoples don't have running water. So they're not able to even wash their hands if they wanted to. So there's those big barriers. And there's also been a widespread impact on our youth sport, which is very important and very much a community gathering place. And the North American Indigenous Games have already been both postponed, and that was over 5,000 Indigenous youth that would come together every year. And so that's been a big impact for sure. And we're also seeing, just like Tracey mentioned in Australia, and our tribes are having their own kind of ways of dealing with these issues. My tribe personally have shut down the reservation, and you can't get in or you can get off, but you can't get in without your tribal ID. And so there's an interesting impact there, but it's really definitely hurting our youth sport. I know kind of globally youth sport is a big player in this as well. We talked about professional, and I also, as a professor at a Division III school, saw so many seniors and just not, so many student athletes who had their seasons kind of stolen from them right there at the kind of last second, and they're just heartbroken and can't really understand it. They've not seen someone impacted, firsthand, and they're not like the Division I level athletes who may be able to retain a scholarship for the next year. So that extra year of eligibility is a little bit harder for them to really recoup. So it's a variety of levels I'm seeing the impact, but definitely it's been tough to see it kind of ravage our communities.
Thanks, Natalie. Ilhaam, you are kind of got a couple different levels. You're at the university level in another country, not the United States, so in South Africa, but also you are one of the places where there's some big time pro sports too, and you look at the rest of Africa as well. What's been going on there the past couple of weeks?
Good evening from Cape Town, everybody. Last week, our president announced a 21-day lockdown. But I think what helped South Africa a lot was that a week before, a lot of universities and schools were actually planning to close after the first quarter of education. During that same week, that was 2 weeks ago, a lot of meetings took place, and our Ministry of Sport, Arts and Culture has been very instrumental from a sporting point of view to engage our various national sport organizations. And everybody agreed that we needed to stop all of the major events. Of course, different committee structures needed to go into detail so that they make the decisions that are relevant for them. But in general, sport is basically completely shut down here in South Africa. This is both at the professional level, your amateur level, as well as your community sport level. Even our health and fitness centers, they are all closed. So I think all of this happened within a space of 3 to 4, 5 days. So one can just imagine all of the work, the long hours of work that had gone into all of this. I also think that from an African point of view, we quickly made certain decisions, even though some of these championships are planned during much later in the year. Bringing it back to South Africa, I think that about 17 of our national championships, we need to make a decision whether those are going to go ahead or not. For the Federation for African University Sport, about 16 sport codes were due to participate in a competition later this year in August. And the same for the Confederation for University Colleges, Zone 6. About 10 sport codes were due to participate in the Zone 6 competition. So quite a bit has happened here in Africa. Cancellations of important championships. Now, for those of you that are familiar with the Federation for International University Sport, FISU, there is the Summer Universiade that is due to take place next year, and that has also been subsequently postponed just a week post the new dates for the Olympics. And the cancellation of these tournaments has a major impact because this is where the countries select their national teams. And a further impact, of course, based on the education system here in South Africa, we don't know when this is going to resume. But I was informed that today that our vice chancellors, the university structure here in South Africa, had a very good meeting today, and essentially about 90% of the universities are ready to go on online platforms to proceed with the academic calendar. And there are already discussions in terms of how the program will have to be adjusted. And the reason why I mentioned this is that essentially we cannot make any major decisions right now, particularly universities, around new dates for our championships, because the academic program, we are aware, and I think we pretty much agree that has to come first. And if you look at the schools program, we have new freshman women that's due to join the university, and all of those factors will have to be considered. But I think overall a major impact. I want to share with Tracey the issue of running and whether you can go and run, whether you can walk your dog. That's been quite an interesting discussion on the social networks. And again, it's about interpretation. But I think a huge acknowledgement to our government and our leadership. Even private and sector and public sector came together to take hands so that we're able to make decisions quickly to flatten the curve here in Africa. So as far as sport is concerned, we're absolutely sad. I think virtual sport and e-sport is enjoying a very good space currently. We might have a couple of youngsters that are developing some new games, you never know. But in general, Africa has been quiet. We try to stay connected on the different social networks to keep each other motivated and try and plan to understand what's going to happen 3-4 months from now.
Thank you, Ilhaam. Jim Skinner, why don't you tell us what's going on in Europe, and then Steve, we'll close out with this segment, and you tell us about the United States beyond the reservations. James.
Thanks, Ken, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel. Well, we're locked down like everybody else in the UK. We have rules that we must follow. At the moment, we're only allowed out if we want to go to the supermarket or to go grocery shopping. We are allowed to exercise once a day on your own or in a two. If it's above that, then it has to be a member of your household or your family. And the police do have the authority to enforce it with fines. But it has been a while coming. They're a little bit worried this weekend, actually, because we've got temperatures of about 20 degrees Celsius on the way, which in the UK, for those of you know, as soon as the sun comes out, everybody goes outside and the parks are packed. And it's been a while since we've had some decent weather. So there's a lot of messaging just this evening from government about the need to remain strong and adhere to the guidelines, because they're conscious that people have been locked up now for about 10 or 11 days. With the sunshine coming out, there's a good chance that some people, especially those with young families, etc., will want to venture outside and get some fresh air. So there's a lot of messaging at the moment to try and keep people on track to follow the guidelines that government has laid out for everybody. In terms of sport, there was some hesitancy in the UK to move on things. It was a bit of a waiting game to see what would happen. And I guess the real catalyst for the changes that have occurred came when a high-profile Premier League manager, Mikel Arteta, for Arsenal FC, was diagnosed with COVID-19 on, I think, the Friday before the weekend's games. As a consequence of that, Arsenal's game was obviously cancelled and the Premier League shut itself down very quickly. And from memory, I think games were postponed at that point until April 3, pending further notice. That then was the catalyst for other changes that followed. So, we're now, sport is just shut down from the grassroots right through to the pro elite level. And when I say grassroots, like other parts of the world, so I mean gyms as well. You can't even go to a gym to work out. So your physical activity is quite limited. to home gyms and to your daily exercise that you're allowed to do once a day. I guess what it's shown is just how much sport is part of the social fabric of the UK community, and taking it away from people they've realised just how much it's a part of their lives, and we've constantly had events being shut down in the UK. The most recent one, the iconic tennis championship, Wimbledon, was cancelled, and that has caused reactions. When you think that Wimbledon hasn't been cancelled since 1945, it's the first time it's happened since the Second World War. The impact of COVID-19 is well and truly taking its hold in the UK. There's been a lot of debate as well, and hesitancy to cancel seasons, if seasons should actually be stopped or if they should be played through to conclusion. A lot of that debate is centred, or has part within it, is the issues around broadcasting contracts, how much organisations will lose. A lot of that debate also centres on issues around promotion and relegation. And in the UK, as you can imagine, football is at the centrepiece of everything. So, without football, the community just doesn't seem the same. And interestingly, today, the Premier League just announced that the competition is to be suspended indefinitely. So they're not quite sure if they will finish the season. They're determined to finish the season. Otherwise, the Premier League clubs have to return to the broadcasters about £750 million in broadcast revenues.
Economics have nothing to do with any of these decisions.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. It's an interesting debate. But today, the Premier League proposed that all Premier League players should take a 30% pay cut to do their part to contribute to the downturn that sport's actually experiencing. The Premier League today also fast-tracked £125 million in support payments to the EFL, the English Football League, which is divisions, the Championship and League One and League Two, so the three divisions below the Premier League, and the National League, which is one below League Two. So in the football pyramid, there's support coming from the Premier League down to those levels. And the Premier League has also contributed, I think, about £20 million to the NHS, the National Health Service, to help with the fight against COVID-19.
So James, when I get to the closeout, I do want to talk about the social responsibility issue.
Yeah,
and actually ask our listeners to think about it something. We've got a poll question on that, and we have a poll question coming up soon. And James was sort of alluding to this in the United States and maybe around the globe. The determination of what's an essential activity has been kind of the determining factor on who can go out and who can go where. In the United States, in many places, liquor stores have been essential locations, so they have remained open. Churches have not in some places. There's some big debate in Florida now. So one question is how essential is sports? So we're going to ask that in a moment of our audience. Steve, why don't you take us to the United States? Just give us a few minutes on where things are.
Well, it was thanks again for having me, and look forward to networking with this great panel and commentators and the audience who might follow up through our contacts that I know Arizona State's providing. So the process in the United States was pretty similar to what James talked about for the English Premier League. There's a lot of uncertainty. The NBA moved to playing indoors, and then immediately one of the players tested positive. And that was the catalyst to shut down the NBA, which immediately just caused a cascading effect to basically shut down all commercialized sport in the United States. And when I say commercialized sport, for foreign listeners, that includes the huge sports of college basketball and college football in the United States. So commercialized sports have been completely shut down. The other dynamic in the United States, in addition to how are we going to continue to pay the professional athletes, which is the issue everywhere else, is that college football and basketball subsidizes a broad range of sports on campus. And if those revenue streams were lost, it's not only a problem for college football and basketball, the commercialized sports, but it's also a problem because Penn State tennis and Arizona State ice hockey doesn't exist without the subsidies that they get from the commercialized sports. With regard to youth sport, I thought Natalie raises a very interesting question, and this hopefully would be a topic that I can hopefully get, Ken and I have been talking about this for years, but hopefully we could get another ASU Global Sports Institute program on this, which is the inequality of access to youth sport. And from what I hear from Natalie, in this case, it's one of those rare examples where among underprivileged groups, Aboriginals may be more advanced than other groups in the sense that there is active programs of community engagement in Aboriginal sports. The reality is in the United States and North America, that's really not the case. And so youth sports have been closed down. But the biggest impact on the closing down of youth sports is that rich suburban kids do not have all their rich private clubs to play in, as opposed to other countries or maybe the reservation where youth sports are actually affected. There is still the opportunity it's state by state in the United States, and there's some states that haven't done anything yet, but by and large, the United States is on, people are using a variety of terms borrowed from other crises that I think are misnomers, but they're using what I call semi-quarantine. You are allowed to go out and walk or run or hike and engage in social distancing. And that form of exercise seems to be pretty prevalent, even in highly concentrated cities like New York City, where people are still able to do this and keep their distance. That is the sort of only physical activity around. I think the comment also raises an important question for those of us who think about sports, about the role of competitive sports. And I sort of feel it proves a point I've been making for a number of years. If we all lived in a benign dictatorship, nobody would probably engage in competitive sports because of the risk of injuries and all sorts of other things. We'd all go on runs, swims, pushing a ball cooperatively, all sorts of other things. The problem is that we don't live in a dictatorship, and if you leave people to their own devices, that is not the form of exercise they do. So many people exercise through competitive sports. They join their local clubs, they join their local teams, they have the community binding effect, and that has been lost during this pandemic. And hopefully one of the silver linings of the pandemic will be that we have greater appreciation for the ways that the competitive sports both affects public health and social adhesion and inclusion.
So we're getting some great questions from our attendees. What about fan attendance? One comment from a guy, Preston James, was it would have been madness if we didn't shut down March Madness. So a lot of great engagement going on there. But we want to ask our first poll question, and everyone has talked about, as I said, the nature of shutting down and the importance of sport, kind of that contradiction. So the question is, should sport be considered essential right now? So just respond yes or no on that. The panelists are not allowed to vote, so there will be no bias in this. So as this is coming up, there's another question about, people are curious about what's being shown around the world in terms of what's being broadcast in lieu of live sport. So I definitely want to hear from Steve and Tracey. Certainly you're in the business. I want to hear what you guys are doing in Australia.
One of the things that this episode has shown, I think, is some of the bargaining problems when sports grant all their rights to major media companies who then don't fully exploit their rights. And makes it difficult in general for globalized sports to be licensed in places where it's just not worth their time to license it, and then you can't get it. I have joked with my Australian friends that it would be really great if we could work out a deal where Americans could see live the entire last year of the Australian Football League season. Because except for maybe a few hardcore people in the grand final, no one in the United States, if they don't Google the result, will possibly remember who won the Collingwood-Essendon match from last year, and we can watch it and learn. Likewise, I bet there are a lot of Australians who probably don't remember what happened in every NBA game or Major League Baseball game like for last year. But the problem is, even today, if you go to the AFL website, the only way you could get last year's matches is to pay this huge fee that they properly charge to the hardcore expatriate Australians who are willing to watch it. So by and large, people are showing old content of famous classic games that everyone knows the answer to anyway. Unless you are a hardcore supporter, I'm watching the Dodgers 1965 World Series victory, that's not really doing it for people. And it would be an interesting way to come up with content people will watch.
Well, Steve, we got our poll results, and I want to hear from Tracey. And by the way, I am not watching old sports. I'm watching old Westerns, which is not a global thing, Gunsmoke and Bonanza and that sort of thing, but that's a whole nother story. So our poll results is no, 60% no, that sport should not be considered essential even in times of crisis. So reactions to that before we go to Tracey. Reactions to the poll result. Is that what you anticipated? Anybody?
I'm surprised by it. One of the things we've not really talked about so far tonight is what actually is sport, because it constitutes a whole bunch of things. And if we take it as being synonymous with health and well-being, I would argue that it is as important and relevant as it has ever been. Just the fact that we need to stay physically fit. If you're going to sit in your house for 10 weeks, you think about muscle wastage and clogging arteries and all of those kinds of things. This is really, really important. But I think, going back to what you were also talking about reruns, I think the reruns are really important because right now we're in the business of nostalgia. Right. And I know there's no other content to show. There's no other content to show, but that nostalgia is really, really important. Because I think for a lot of people, what they're doing is they're looking back at the past and thinking about a different time when we weren't living with the current pressures. And so in those terms, I think the nostalgia business is actually very important. I also think too, there's a third element, and that's what happens next. Because sooner or later, we're going to come out of our houses. We've been locked up with our families for 10 weeks. We're going to be pretty wound up by that, some of us. And so in terms of socializing with other people again, in terms of reestablishing our identities, rebuilding our communities, engaging with people, trying to seek solutions to problems that sport can contribute to. In my view, I think sport now is more important than ever.
Can I just add?
Please.
I'll feed in after you go ahead, Andre. I'll feed in afterwards.
The funny thing is there are still 3 football leagues around the world that are playing: Belarus, Burundi, and Nicaragua. And the Belarusian league is actually sold TV rights to like 10 different countries where people are thirsting for live sports, which is somewhat crazy. But going to the poll question, it's interesting. And I agree with Simon that part of it is how you define sport. But one of the things that I feel is different about the current moment. Normally, we're accustomed to thinking about, is sport essential or appropriate to continue in times, when we think about it in terms of national crises, we tend to think of wartime, right? Like should, and you back to World War II in the United States and the famous letter that FDR writes to the governor of baseball 1 month after Pearl Harbor, as the green light letter, telling baseball it's not only appropriate for you to continue playing. Essentially, Major League Baseball was seeking guidance and permission. President Roosevelt said, like now more than ever, the benefit, the service that 5,000 ball players provide to 20 million Americans is more needed now than ever before. But we're accustomed to that debate. Should Fell have paid 1 week, 2 weeks after 9/11, and so forth on, given the appropriateness and given the public resources go into a sporting event when there might be other priorities. What is about this current pandemic and this challenge to sport is it's not just about appropriateness given the gravity of the challenge at hand and the trade-offs of the entertainment and the protection of the athlete himself, the athlete who has to perform. And we've had this whole thing transition where, as James was alluding to earlier, the Premier League and the NBA felt, okay, well, we can do this if we close the stadiums. And, everybody's at home, everybody's streaming Netflix anyways, like live sport is all the more needed now. But of course, we couldn't go on that way because an Arsenal manager, a Utah Jazz player, Chelsea players tested positive, and guess what? It's not like they've pulled their hamstring, sit out for a week or two, for a few weeks. It's the entire team has to go into quarantine, right? So we're really struggling with how to figure this one out. But I do tend to push back to people who want to say, well, sport is frivolous and we need to focus on other things. I think for a lot of the reasons that we're talking about, not just in terms of our own fitness when we perform sport, but I think also how sport connects us as fans. I don't want to minimize this. I might, saying it's essential in a time like this is sort of a daunting thing to.
Well, there's a couple.
I'm a little bit in that. I'm a little bit in that camp.
Well, there are a couple of interesting comments from people who apparently voted yes. I mean, one is that in the darkest of times, from a guy Rick Walls, in the darkest of times, sports has always been essential and gotten so you're sort of alluding to those sorts.
Just quickly. Sure. And then I'll let Tracey talk about the other impacts you were discussing. I think Simon alludes to a really interesting point there. I think if we say physical activity or exercise, it's really important for communities. Yeah, and that's why I think the UK government here has allowed people out to exercise once a day. For most of us are doing that for an hour, and I think that's important for your mental health. And then there's this conversation about, is sport essential? And I think one of the phrases that's probably resonating here is a comment that was made recently by a famous Italian football coach, and everything is about football in the UK at the moment, is that football is the most important thing of the least important things in life. And I think that message is really resonating in the sense that people are here in the UK saying, yeah, we love sport. Sport is part of what we are as a society and what we are as a community, but saving lives is more important. And I think the government is running that message as well. And athletes and players are singing to that tune, and they're committed to it as well. So I think, in the darkest times, sport does act as a vehicle to bring us together and to get us through challenging circumstances. But in these situations where sport can actually be a catalyst to increase risk on communities and lead to the spread of the disease, I think there's recognition that there is a need to stop for a short period of time and work our way through it. And then we're talking about a celebration when it's all over, a sporting celebration in which communities have come together and realise just how important it is to everything they do.
Thanks, James. So Tracey, I want to hear what's been shown in Australia, and then Ilhaam, we'll go to you next. Tracey.
So in Australia, it's pretty similar actually. They're pulling games out of the vault, historic matches, ones that people remember with some sort of fondness, but they're doing it a bit differently. They're not just replaying the commentary. they've got the modern day commentators who essentially face the prospect of not having a job for a season, sitting in a studio and calling the old match as though it was happening this weekend. And it's quite funny because they get so involved in it that they actually forget. They know the result, they know who scored, they know who won and lost. And then afterwards, they have this really in-depth conversation because they've noticed a whole lot of things that, you know, they may not have noticed when they weren't calling the match 10, 20, 30 years ago. But I don't know how sustainable that is for the viewers for the many reasons that Steve was talking about as well. But I also think it's a very important question that's been raised about what is sport and how vital it is, because you've got that real pull between what is grassroots and community and what is elite. And I know that there's been some discussion. I was having one on my own program yesterday with a panel of 3 people about the engagement. There seems to be a vacuum that has been created in many senses where the elite is so elite and grassroots is just forgotten, and that will come back together because of this. So this is looking for the silver lining from this COVID-19 crisis. So there's all of those elements wound into it as well. But the role that the elite athletes are playing, and I know it's been very strong in the USA and different parts of Europe. I don't know if it's the same sense here in Australia, but that need, and a lot of people talking about that sport is necessary because it's what we tune into, it's what we enables us to disengage from the monotony of our own lives. Sometimes it gives us a high each weekend. It gives us a community to come to. And I think that's what's been so interesting in this, is watching people respond to that sense of, if you're not working at the moment because your work has been shut down or there's only minimal staff at the office and you've been encouraged to work from home, the only people you see might be the 1 or 2 or 3 other people you live with. If you live by yourself, you feel very isolated. That sense of community, especially after World War II, has very much been built around sport. And I think we're starting to notice even people who don't like sport so much and don't spend a lot of time watching or listening to it like we all do, I think they're starting to understand as well that connection that it provides in societies, in some instances, that have become so big and overwhelming that the individual is lost. And it's that community of sport that enables them to be part of something that is not just their own lives as an individual.
Thanks, Tracey. Ilhaam, you had some thoughts from South Africa?
Yes, thank you. But I'd like to share a comment by one of our participants, Travis Kalowa. I hope I'm pronouncing the surname correct. As a college athlete, I believe that the safety of yourself, teammates, and others involved are very important than a few games that may end up exposing you to the virus. So for some people, sport is not that important. Being able to have a meal a day is far more important. There are more people dying every year because of hunger. So I'm very pleased by the outcome of this question, because it shows me that as sports people, we have not been living in our own bubbles. We've taken note of what's happening across the rest of the globe. And I want to say thank you to the people who participated in this, because in terms of the types of economies that you have as a country, that I think informs your thinking around the importance of sport. And so for me, the socioeconomic circumstances definitely plays a role. So if you look at Africa, if you look at where we at as Africa, and I believe that this is one of the reasons why South Africa could make decisions so quickly without having unnecessary quabbles about what should happen and what should not happen. Where some of the bigger codes, even the professional sport codes, have gone into their own spaces to come up with solutions. Because we are all saying that at the end of the day, we will not be there if we don't take responsibility now to flatten the curve. So I'm very pleased by the outcome of the results that our audience shared with us.
Yeah, Ilhaam, that's actually one of my students, so I'm really proud of it. And he he's had to log on from Hawaii really early mornings on our online classes lately. So I'm proud of them. But
he didn't beat Australia though. He got on early, but he didn't get
true. True. And I just wanted to.
That's great,
I'm loving seeing the conversation, and a couple things Victoria Jackson mentioned, and this goes back, I think, to how we think of sport and society. I think, and equality, equity, and talking about women's sports. You know, last night ESPN here in the States showed a football game, Rose Bowl from 2008, and wow, that was, you know, pretty popular. I saw on Twitter some success, but it's like Steve said, why couldn't we be showing Australian football, or what about women's sports, you know? And it was only after some pressure that they moved the WNBA draft up to be on ESPN. And so I think this is a good time for us to look at and question, and not only the sports as, you know, as a competition in the playing and the fitness side, but also our consumption of sport and through the media, and how the media kind of projects certain things that we maybe want to really change. And we've been all fighting to change for a while. And maybe this is a good time. You know, we're going to talk about kind of the reset. And so I think this is a good time to call into questions for all these things, and thinking about, you know, those people who are underserved.
Yeah, I mean that's great, and from our D3 institution in the U.S., I mean that's kind of the way sport is thought of, and then from the indigenous communities, kind of the sport for sport's sake rather than the monetary side of it. So what I want to do is I want to, in a moment, hear from Steve. He's been raising his hand patiently, so we'll hear from Steve, and then Simon, I want you to talk a little bit about reset, because we're going to ask the poll question about, as Natalie alluded to, do we have the opportunity for sport to reset? And I want, before our listeners vote, I want to get a kind of a feel what we're thinking about when we say reset. So Steve?
I was just going to make, I wanted to make two comments. One is that when we think about the impact of professional sports shutting down, when we think about it in the United States, it's entertainment and high paid service. When we think about South African rugby, the professional sports is what pays for the grassroots game. And in particular, the post-apartheid effort of South African Rugby Union to reach out to the Black community that was previously excluded under apartheid. So there's a real social component of solidarity in South Africa that is currently missing in the United States. And I'll save the rest of my comments to the reset on that, but just to note that that distinction. The other thing I wanted to say, as I was thinking more about the comments, and Natalie's comment is a great one, if they rebroadcast the WNBA from last year, how many people really remember what happened in every game? And you could watch it without knowing the answer. And there I want to sort of cynically raise the question about why broadcasters are not doing it. And it perhaps is because so many people only watch the games for gambling purposes. And while it is true that if you're a true fan, I could sit there and watch Essendon Carlton or the LA versus Connecticut in the WNBA, not know the results, and trust myself not to go on Google and watch for my personal entertainment, you can't gamble on a game that's already happened. And I think it raises the question, to what extent is sport not just an isolating thing that James alluded to, but has become hooked into this addiction for gambling and is so linked now that if there are no gambling opportunities, the demand for sport falls off.
So Simon, talk to us about this opportunity to reset, kind of playing off of what both Natalie and Steve put out there. Then others, if you've got comments after Simon, love to hear them before we go to a poll to the listeners.
Sorry, can you ask me that question again?
Yeah, sure.
In just a sec. The reason I was mildly distracted is, number one, I was pouring water. And number two, Anthony Weems. I particularly like Anthony Weems's question, because he wants to talk about the politics of sport and the virus. And as an individual, I'm particularly interested in this intersection of sport, business, and politics. So Anthony, if we don't talk about this tonight, email me. We can talk. Ken.
I know we'll talk about it. We'll talk about that next. And I think it also fits within the reset too, and especially in the United States when we think about reset. There's certainly been a lot of politics interwoven with sport over the past couple of years in a way that it had not been since the 60s. So in some sense, if there's an opportunity for a renewal, that might be something that people might contemplate. You know, can we move politics out of sport? I'm not advocating that, but that could be one reason for reset. But Simon, when we were talking earlier, you were talking about reset issues in a different sort of way.
Sure.
Why don't you talk?
Yeah, sure. I guess in Europe, and we'll go down into to Asia and across Asia, but certainly in Europe and certainly in Britain, where I've spent a considerable part of my life, we've been living in a period of revolution, because many people in Europe are used to the old style socio-cultural defined sport that many of us were born and brought up with. And so this is kicking a ball outside your house, and it's about innocence, and it's more about participating than anything else. It's not about money or sponsorships or legal rights or contracts. Whereas now that's where we live. That's what we've been living. And if you take the English Premier League as an example, or Formula One, but even sports like rugby union, cricket, they have become, or they are becoming, very different to what most Europeans are used to and feel comfortable with. And so what people are now beginning to talk in terms of is this being a reset moment. And I think this is born of people's frustrations with what's been happening, but also being a reflection of, I think, certainly what's happening in Britain over the last 3 or 4 weeks. I'll give the example of the Cheltenham Festival, the Cheltenham Horse Racing Festival. And public health officials were saying, really, this shouldn't go ahead. Yet nobody in government actually took the decision to stop it going ahead. But there was a feeling that the event was allowed to go ahead because there was too much money involved. And this is being replicated across a whole bunch of sports, that they were going ahead. Liverpool, Atletico Madrid in the Champions League was another example. It was allowed to go ahead because there was too much money involved. So people are now saying, okay, enough. And so I think there's at one level, there's a certain degree of opportunity because some of us are hankering for the past, but at the same time, there's also a genuine concern around, is money dominating more than anything else? So, okay, let's reset. The question then becomes, is reset to what? And when we talked, Ken, earlier, reset to what? Reset to 10 years ago, reset to 20 years ago, reset to the mid-20th century. And there's also then an issue around, okay, so we agreed to reset and we know what we're going to reset to. Who's going to do that? And so there are some really, I think, political and deeply ideological questions there about, are we talking about sports ministries, or are we talking about commercial partners, or are we talking about sports governing bodies? So there are some really fundamental questions, I think, right now being thrown up by the virus that at the moment we're not answering, but going forward we need to.
So let's put the poll up now. The question is, should sport entities take the time to reset? Should sport entities take the time to reset? Yes or no? Is this a moment to reset sport? So we'll see what comes up there. So we've got a lot of engagements. We're going to go a little bit over the allotted closing time. Hopefully all of our panelists can stay with us. If you, where else do you have to go? People are asking me, can I do X, Y, Z? As long as I don't have something else scheduled, I'm easy to find right now.
It's on my schedule to go to the kitchen, so
And we're all heading out to all heading out to a virtual nightclub after this.
Can I say something about the reset?
Sure.
So I was seeing unicorns and rainbows when Simon was talking about the resetting to a time of purity where we appreciated sport for the sake of sport. And I do think that there is a lot of disgust with how commercialized sport has become and the influx of money into all our professional leagues. I do think, though, that we should be a little bit cautious about romanticizing the reset that's coming, especially when you think about areas of the world like Latin America. In times of prosperity, and professional sport in Latin America, like everywhere else, has been enjoying a time of prosperity. We're very focused on inequality, and rightfully so. But when the prosperity ends and there's time and you know, markets bust, what follows is often brings with it greater preoccupations and inequality. It's just utter, you know, equally distributed poverty and scarcity. And so, just as an example, we've had in the last few years in Latin America the beginnings of a viable women's footballing in countries like Mexico, Peru, Argentina, and oftentimes that has been the result of this prosperity and this influx of money, where professional clubs have been told by FIFA and by societal pressures, hey, you know, if you're going to have a men's soccer team, we're going to create a league and you're going to have to support a women's team too, which has opened up tremendous avenues for participation. And it's not equal, and people have rightfully been, you know, clamoring for the women's soccer players to be treated well, if not, you know, paid the millions of dollars that the men are paid. But there has been tremendous progress. And so when I think about the reset that's going to come when these leagues are decimated and we have a financial crisis in these emerging sports markets, I think the first thing that's going to go are those things that, you know, a lot of these teams and leagues and men making these shots always thought of sort of almost like frivolous accessories that were sort of forced upon them. And, you know, when they have to come back to basics, I think a lot of those avenues and openings are going to be pulled back, similar to governmental public assistance for grassroots sport. You know, when you look at what's going to happen to the finances and the budgets of federal governments and state governments in countries like Brazil and Argentina and Mexico, you know, good luck sport and recreation budgets and what that's going to mean. So I understand that every crisis is an opportunity, and we need to refocus and think about basics. But in terms of like how this is going to play out in the real world, I kind of shudder at what the reset's going to look like.
So people are really looking forward to the moment to reset. 77% say yes, 13% say no, 10% don't know. What's wrong with you people? 10% don't know what's going to happen. So, Steve, were you raising your hand there? Was that okay? Then Tracey, I want to hear about Australia on resetting and what that means, and then James as well.
Well, yeah, this is a hobby horse. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Tracey. You go first.
I don't mind. I love listening to you, so please go ahead.
Well, thank you. I was going to, this is, I admit, part of my current research, but I'm not surprised to hear an Englishman and an American talk about the longing and the people complaining about excessive commercialization, and then someone who's a Latin American raise a different perspective. Outside of the northern rich sports, there is a very strong and has always been a strong solidarity link between grassroots and the commercial aspects. The commercial aspects are what pay for socially progressive grassroots sports, and specifically the opportunity to help young people who can't afford to participate by having their parents join private clubs. That is simply missing notwithstanding all the nice sounds, in the United States and Great Britain. When I think people's attitude toward the Liverpool Champions League game would be very different if it was absolutely clear that some large percentage of that money was going to provide training, facilities, and other opportunities for underprivileged kids in Britain, immigrant kids to become socially inclusive, etc. And those programs would be lost if they cancel the game. The reality is that's not happening, because in the United States and England, those opportunities are not true. As I've written previously in my scholarship, if Jackie Robinson and Roberto Clemente were 15 years old today in South Pasadena and Carolina, Puerto Rico, they would never play baseball because their parents couldn't afford to join traveling teams and those opportunities. And so one of the things that I think there might be an opportunity for reset in the wealthy countries is to think about what are the obligations of the commercial leagues and whether it's time to start expecting there to be a link, which would not only be socially responsible, but also would then, in the long run, help the commercial leagues fend off critiques of commercialization, because then the Luddites who object to any commercialization that is actually popular with the sports fan, et cetera, is taking, I use an Australian phrase when I say this, you're taking boots off of poor kids in Wagga Wagga when you operate in some traditional way that does not commercialize the sport to its maximum potential and then share some of the money with those who need it.
So Tracey, then James, then I've got a couple of questions, and then we're going to be to kind of the closing commentary. That'll pretty much get us there. So be thinking about your final kind of parting shots there. But Tracey?
So a discussion that I had yesterday was with 3 people who've been involved with the highest levels of sport, both in Australia and internationally. So one was a former Director General of WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency, and he's now in charge of the international, the integrity unit for world athletics. One of the others was a former CEO of the National Rugby League and then CEO of Football Federation, looking after soccer for men and women here in Australia. And the other was who recently stepped down as the CEO of the Australian Sports Commission. And prior to that, she was in charge of Netball Australia, which is one of the biggest sports contested by women here. And all 3 of them said, without a doubt, that this is pause that needs to be used so wisely by government, by administration, by everybody involved in sport, to think about what it's going to look like when it comes out the other side to make it better. And the one thing that was most evident was that return to community values and involving the community, but also this gender issue. I asked them specifically about gender because I had the same concerns, and I know a lot of women's teams have the same concerns, that they'll be the first thing that's chopped off when budgets are redevised because they're so much smaller. And all of them said, but that is the future. That is where the growth in sport is. Because if you look at sport as it's played by men, and again, we're getting back to the professional leagues mostly, it's reached a ceiling point. There's virtually nowhere left for it to go. And that only other area of growth is actually for the women's teams to be promoted and for women and girls to come into sport, to increase numbers, to change who's watching, to change the whole dynamic. And so they said it's not even a gender issue anymore, it's a product issue. And if you're in charge of the product of sport, then sport has to be available for everybody. It's no longer man versus woman. The men's team earns the money and the women spend the money. That's not how the model works anymore. And this is part of the redefining of what sport should look like coming out, post-pandemic.
I'm feeling a great call to action on Reset, focused on access on all kinds of levels from both the panelists and from the questions and comments that are streaming as we talk. And we kind of, Simon brought this up as a kind of a casual mention the other day, but I'm really seeing the impact that raising that issue is having on people. But James.
Thanks, Ken. I guess my comments are partly tainted by the fact that I lead an Institute for Sport Business. And we prepare graduates to work in the business of sport. And a large part of that is the commercial side of the sector, of the industry, which is continuing to expand and grow. We're talking about mature markets, but if we look at emerging markets, places like India, China, regions like the Middle East, Africa, the commercial pull of sport in those markets is getting stronger and stronger. And these parts of the world are quickly catching up. And a lot of sport organisations, we take the NBA, for example, they see great potential in these type of marketplaces. So I don't think that commercial drive for sport will actually stop. We might reflect and think a little bit about what values we place around sport, which becomes important. There's this interesting tension with sport, and as Simon was saying, you know, around the politics of sport. I think there's this tension that, you know, sport on one hand contributes to the economy in many ways. On the other hand, it's a big player in public health and well-being and health, and the social impact that it has on communities. You know, and what this debate has brought to the forefront here in the UK, for example, is the massive wages that Premier League players are on. And, you know, if they should be paying that amount of money to play football. But at the same time, on the other side, if we look at, let's say, the taxation revenue that the Premier League, the players and the clubs brought in, it's very substantial. In 2016, 2017, the Premier League, the clubs and the players paid about £3.3 billion in taxation revenue. That goes back into a society that can be then filtered back into other parts that are, you know, into health, into education, into law and order. And there's lots of fragmented industries that, you know, emerge around sport as well as a consequence. So while we might think about resetting it, and we might have, I think as Andrea said, this romanticized view of sport, I think we need to consider some of the other positive things that the commercialization of sport also brings to the table. But it's how we manage those and how we deal with them moving forward, which I think becomes an important conversation.
Okay. Simon, you had a comment?
Yeah, I mean, again, we framed the conversation about resetting in probably broadly the same way as we framed the questioning and the answers in the rest of the session, and I go back to Anthony's observation about politics. What's become particularly significant, if we take European football as one example, is this is not just about football and business, it's also about politics. And so, for instance, you have the case in Manchester with Manchester City and City Football Group. UEFA is currently taking action for breach of financial fair play regulations against Manchester City. Many of your students and the people who are here this evening will know that Manchester City, the City Football Group, is owned by the Abu Dhabi government. And so this kind of hyper commercialization that we're seeing is being fueled by not just North American sports entrepreneurs, or for that matter, Western European sports entrepreneurs. What you've got in there are governments. And this is a characteristic of not just the Middle East, but also Central Asia and East Asia too. And so in terms of this reset and in terms of the debate about the reset, yeah, okay, grassroots, equality, access, all of these things. But going back to Anthony, and I've got a new friend in Anthony, is try to think about the political context too, and what politically resetting might mean.
So I'm not very good at math, but they're going to throw us off of the internet in 14 minutes. And so I want everybody to give a closing comment that must be less than 2 minutes. But I'm going to go off script and do a little jazz and redirect it a little bit and make your closing comment about this. When do we know it's time to restart sport, and how do we do it in less than 2 minutes? When do we know it's time to restart, and how do we do it? Steve, you're ready to go. I've got my stopwatch going here.
I think we listen to health experts, and we figure out the particular health issues of bringing athletes together, and how through testing and other ways it is safe to do that. And when it is safe for athletes to gather and practice and get ready and compete, then we can think about bringing a sport back, at least on a streaming basis. But to me, this is ultimately an epidemiological and infectious disease problem of people who have medical degrees and doctorates, and not something for a bunch of sports experts.
There's some great comments too, I should say, about esports. I mean, a lot of great comments, and how esports fits in, and whether or not sports has ever gone because esports is going on and all that sort of thing. So I don't want to. We're not ignoring that. That's a whole nother conversation. whose hand went up next there? Who's
So
Ilhaam?
we don't know. We don't know, Ken. I think we have to listen to the health experts, decisions that our governments will make. But I think as part of my closing comment, and I'm going to borrow this from my husband who reminded me yesterday, you know, the late Nelson Mandela said that sport has the power to change the world. And he's gone and inspired millions and millions of other people across the world by his leadership and emphasizing the importance of sport. And with this crisis that we're dealing with, this pandemic, we should remind ourselves, what else can we do other than the things that we are used to? So Nelson Mandela spent 9,958 days in jail. I've only been at my house a couple of days. And if that does not inspire me, then I don't know what else will. And I think for me, as part of the closing comment is that we have a lot of people that have inspired us and still continue to inspire us. Let's think about that, and let's use that as an opportunity, because if Nelson Mandela could come out of jail and ensure a democratic South Africa, even with all of our challenges, we remain a resilient nation. And I'm confident that across the globe, every person, whether you're a participant, whether you're just a fan, whether you're in academia, whatever your contribution is in sport, I'm sure that you will find something to inspire you. And I'd like to say to our participants, it's been wonderful to listen to you. So Craig Hobbs, you are absolutely correct. The business of sports and its global benefits can definitely grow if we look at participation, and particularly different forms of physical activity that's diverse and that is accessible. Because at the end of the day, if sport does not contribute to a better and a healthier nation, then we've got to press that reset button. And yes, I hope that the people with the money will start to romanticize about women. So thank you, Tracey. I just absolutely love the comments that you've made. I really appreciate that. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Ken, and the rest.
Thank you, Ilhaam. James.
Thanks, Ken. I wish I knew the answer to your question, but I think at the end of the day, Steve's right. You know, we've got to listen to medical experts, and we've done so in the past. If you look at the history of sport in recent times, you know, we've had a number of major health crises, and we've turned to the medical experts to help us get through it. You know, we don't have to cast our mind back to the late 80s, early 90s with the AIDS, HIV epidemic that took place. How it was met with mixed reactions. There was concerns over athletes competing, particularly in combat, you know, sports. We took medical advice. We had SARS, avian flu in the early 2000s, threatened the Beijing Olympics. We again listened to medical advice. We had the Ebola outbreak in 2014, 2015 that led to the African Nations Cup being shifted from Morocco to Equatorial Guinea on the basis of medical advice. And now we've had COVID-19, which seems to be the most dangerous of all the diseases that we've confronted as an industry. You know, it's interesting, you know, since 72 in Munich, we thought the biggest threat to sport came from terrorism, but now perhaps it's coming from disease, or disease is just as much as a threat. I think the way to overcome it, as my colleagues have said, is we're sport experts, we're not medical experts. Let's leave it to the experts. I think it'll be a gradualized process. People will come back slowly and gradually. They will open the market, they will lift the restrictions gradually, and slowly we will get back to normal. But I can't see it happening, waking up one morning and all of a sudden it's all over and we're back to normal. I think we're in for a bit of a long haul.
All right, let's go. Tracey, Andres, Natalie, and Simon. And I'll throw in this too. I mean, a lot of people are asking about this. Should we restart? And I think it was a better idea. It sounded like a better idea than it does now. Should we restart sport without fans? You know, does that change the calendar at all? I mean, my personal, having not even a doctorate, I have certainly don't have an MD. But my personal has been, nah, that's not a good idea either. But you know, incorporate that in your answer as well. So we go through the last folks. Tracey.
Look, I think everybody has raised such valid points, but all you really needed to do was come here to Australia, to the National Rugby League, to a former rugby league player who has the answer. So his idea was, for his sport specifically, Australia is such an island, and in so many ways we've been protected, I think, from a lot of the highly escalating numbers that we've seen in other countries. But we've got a lot of little islands off the coast. So he wants all of the rugby league players from all of the teams to be tested. If they're clear, they go to this island and they play out the season on the island. That way, everybody's happy. The fans get their sport. The broadcasters get their sport. The players are playing, which is all they really want to do. I don't know how seriously that suggestion's being taken, but some people have been thinking about that. When do we come back and how do we do it? It's anybody's guess at this moment, and there's such a wave with this sickness as well, isn't there? So even when we talk about coming back, especially the global sports, you look at world athletics, you look at world football, you look at the big international tournaments, you look at the Olympic Games, which now, you know, with a postponement of a year, doesn't seem like that far away when you're looking at how this disease is moving across countries and increasing and decreasing, and we still don't know whether there's going to be a second wave according to the seasons in North and South Hemisphere. So all of those issues are still to be determined. Some people have suggested that it comes back slowly. It comes back without crowds until you can guarantee that everybody's going to be clean and not get reinfected, because it just seems that when people come into big groups together, that's when the infection is at its worst. So it's a big challenge, and I don't want us to get back to normal. I want us to get to, or to redefine normal. I want it to be different. I want it to be better when we come back. And I'm sure with all the ideas we've heard today and all of the comments that have been made, that is the situation that we can have.
Emily? Or Andres? What I say?
I think you said me, but I agree with Tracey that, and it's interesting. I think that you're hearing a lot of people speculating about an intermediate step where sport will come back for its fans to entertain us in some way that isn't quite normal, whether it's on an island. You know, I feel like all these different leagues, you know, the NBA is talking about if you could find one secure place and have every team concentrated there. Premier League is also talking about some variant of that. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see that. There's a cautionary tale from history about rushing things. Just again, in terms of, even if you can separate the crowd, let's think about the athletes. The Stanley Cup of the 1919 season had to be suspended way through it because too many players were struck by what was, by I think, the third wave of the Spanish influenza that started in 1980. So again, to Tracey's points, you know, these pandemics have waves, and so we're going to have to be careful on that. I mean, the last live sporting event I watched was on the evening of Sunday, March 15th. I caught what's a Mexico City classic. I was watching on TV, but Cruz Azul America, and that was already being played behind closed doors, which is a weird experience in the Aztec Stadium, a stadium that sits 100,000 people, because you could hear the players talking to each other and you can hear the ball being struck. It's like watching, you know, your favorite teams in a warm-up context. And it was a very sad night. It was a rainy night in Mexico City. They had already announced that even after that weekend of playing behind closed doors, this was it. So you kind of had this sense of that I was, you know, I think I was watching the last football game on earth. And I, you know, being a history nerd, I was thinking back to the quote of the English foreign minister as Europe's going to war about, you know, the lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime. You know, substitute stadium floodlights for lamps. Obviously, it's not going to be for the rest of our lifetime. We will come back. And I hope sport comes back again to what we were talking about earlier, that it all comes back, including the progress that's been made for more inclusivity when it comes to gender parity, but also cross-border in the way that sports connects different societies and countries. This month, our Arizona Diamondbacks, we're going to play the first Major League Baseball game in Mexico City. That gets scratched. That kind of cross-border reaching, I hope it also comes back and isn't seen as another thing that, well, those were luxuries for another time that we can't bring back.
Thanks, Andres.
Absolutely.
Natalie?
Yeah. I know we're running short on time, but I did, I agree with everyone, obviously, that safety does come first. And I do really want to stress the importance, though, of taking advantage of this time that we have to do this reset and hopefully create a new normal, as Tracey mentioned. And I also wanted to stress, I've seen the trend of Indigenous values, as far as sustainability have become more to the forefront. I also think that, our Indigenous people, we value elders. Elders are the very important piece of our communities. And I think that with this virus, especially, that has become very important and very ingrained. So I challenge all of us to think about kind of these other ways we can, engage our communities, and again, going back to that equity piece, and taking the value. And we believe the Creator does things for a reason, and this is a way for us to kind of really reevaluate the way we're doing things. But thank you so much for letting me be a part of this, and everyone's been great.
Thank you for rocking the Caucasians t-shirt there.
Always.
All right, Simon.
Yeah, I think to tie together what quite a few people have said, the first observation I would make is who should sport listen to? And right now, who sport should listen to is medical professionals. They shouldn't listen to me because I don't know. They should listen to people. Sport should listen to medical professionals. But I think that question, whether it was a month ago or a year ago, or if it's in a month's time or a year's time, the answer to that question will be different. But there's something fundamental there about who should sport listen to. The second part linked to that question, and I'll try to keep it short and sharp, is one of the things that strikes me, and I'm one of them, one of the things that strikes me is experts commenting about the current situation in sport, experts. And we've all, we all sit here and say, oh, this is a terrible thing, or that's a terrible thing, and this should happen, and that should happen. What I'm not hearing from a lot of people, in fact, what I'm hearing from very few people at all, including me, is what happens next. And I'm not talking about, do we finish the season? How do we get people back into stadiums and shit? What happens next? And let me wrap up for you, Ken. And you can pay me for this later. I'll invoice you. I'll invoice you. Okay. So let me wrap this up. And I would challenge everybody who's here tonight, and anybody who listens to this, is for the next 5 years, what's your manifesto for sport? So post-virus, what's your manifesto for sport? And I think that's a really important question, because we've talked about reset moments, and we've talked about more access, and we've talked about not forgetting certain communities, and we've talked about contracts and broadcasters, and okay, so what's your manifesto? And I think if everybody here today was able, on a side of A4 or in 5 bullet points, to say this is what I think should happen next, this is my manifesto, because I think I think we need to break out of this current situation. I know it's really important. It's a crisis. It's an emergency. I know those things, but at some stage we're going to have to start looking ahead and moving forwards and beginning to tackle what happens next. What's your manifesto?
So I can just stop now, right? So you've done it for me. I can't thank. Well, everybody, not just the panelists, everybody that participated. I mean, there's been a whole stream of really impactful conversation going on. All of us on this panel do a lot of these kinds of things. I do this, more than I care to. And in many ways, I'll tell you, I thought this would be just another conversation, but this really felt like a needle mover in terms of thinking on this. And I think for me personally, I've been so engaged in the day-to-day. I thought about the bigger issue, but I don't think I really had reflected on it in the way that this conversation has led me to do. So as panelists, we all talked a little bit about potentially doing this again. So I think we do have some topics that remain to be covered, and people will have flexible schedules. Maybe we'll have more concern for Australia and our scheduling of round two, but we will look to do this. So if you follow us, and our Twitter handles and all those things will be in the chat, that would be great. But I want to thank everyone for the time, and we will actually Kendall, the moderator of the moderator, will come on in a moment and give some guidance in terms of how to find this in the future, because we will post the recording of this, and then how to follow us for future events. We've got a related podcast that's coming up that I did with Bill Roden, the great William C. Roden, the author of $40 Million Slaves, focused on this issue. A completely different path. I mean, I thought there'd be a lot of overlap, but completely different path. So people that want to engage more on this issue with two OGs talking about sports and the virus, do take a listen to that. That'll be in the chat as well. But thank you, everybody, for joining us. Take care.
Thank you. Been great.
Bye, everybody.